Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, Executive Director of the Church-State Council, here with my co-host Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine. Together, we're here to recover religious liberty from the political extremes. We're going to start our conversation today with a discussion of a very interesting survey about what Americans know of their First Amendment freedoms. And Bettina, actually, I think your statistics are going to be a little more hopeful than mine, because when I was talking to high school students, they could name more members of the Simpsons family from the television show than they could name First Amendment freedoms. But give us the good, the bad, and the ugly of what this survey is finding about Americans' knowledge and appreciation for their First Amendment rights.
Well, I think you're right, Alan. It's good news and bad news. And I think the good news is that Americans appreciate the First Amendment. Every survey, it's not just this one that came out recently from the Freedom Forum, but every survey on First Amendment issues shows that Americans see this as kind of this defining, unifying thing, that this is what makes America unique. You know, our commitment to free speech, our commitment to personal freedoms, they see it as a unifying thing. That's a good news. The bad news is that there is a little bit of confusion about exactly what those freedoms are and the scope of those freedoms. And so,
it's kind of like the Bible. Everybody says they believe it, but how many people really know what it says or try to practice it, right?
Right, exactly. It sounds good. It sounds great. The details, though, are a little hazy. First of all, there's 5 freedoms that are protected in the First Amendment. Most people cannot name them all. Most people know that religious freedom is protected and free speech, but then they get a little hazy. So I'm going to give you a pop quiz, Alan. What other freedoms are protected in the First Amendment?
Well, I'm going to pause and ask our listeners to give themselves the same quiz. So you've got speech, religion, freedom of the press, the right to peaceably assemble and petition the government for the redress of grievances. What did I miss? Freedom of
so you've got assembly and petition.
Assembly and petition, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they're the 5 freedoms, and I think I always forget petition. It's not one that we commonly refer to, but it is a vital one. The ability to petition the government, to make your your concerns known. So they're the 5.
Well, look at it in this positive light.
Yeah.
We Americans have a right to complain. We have a right to fuss about our government.
But we laugh about that, Alan, but it is such a vital right. And
of course
many
it is.
Citizens of other countries do not have that privilege.
Back when we were celebrating the bicentennial, there was an interview. You had the big, tall ships in New York Harbor and a big celebration. And a Russian is being interviewed there about, how they feel about, American freedoms. And the Russian, this was during the Soviet era. And the Russian said, well, in the Soviet Union, we have freedom to speak. And here in the United States, we have freedom after we speak.
Right. Yes. A very telling distinction right there. It was interesting to me from this survey that when people were asked whether a baker or a website designer, and clearly these are 2 cases that we're well familiar with today, whether they should be able to refuse to create a message that celebrates an occasion that goes against their religious beliefs. 63% of those surveyed said that yes, they should have the right to refuse, which is, of course, in line with recent Supreme Court decisions.
We're going to have to spend more time on these surveys, but we really need to get into hearing the story from our guest, my good friend and colleague, Richard Fulton.
So, welcome, Richard. We are so delighted to have you today. And for those listening, Richard Fulton is a longtime advocate and analyst on religious freedom issues. And he has had several appearances before congressional committees to testify on issues of religious discrimination in the workplace. He formerly served as Director of National and Legislative Affairs for the American Jewish Committee. And he is currently kept very busy serving as co-chair of the Religious Freedom Committee of the American Bar Association section on civil rights and social justice. He's also an author and quoted extensively as a commentator on these issues. He has a chapter also on religious freedom implications of COVID-19 that's included in an ABA book that's published this summer. So welcome, Dr. Fulton. We're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here with some old friends, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church has long been an important ally in the work on religious freedom, and I think more than any other organization is responsible for the immense developments in the Supreme Court in this area just within the last few months.
Right, and we have worked together extensively, and you have written for Liberty Magazine in the past, and most recently you wrote for Liberty Magazine a fascinating article, and you talked about what it's like being a second-generation Holocaust survivor. Why don't you give us just a little bit of your personal background and just in a nutshell, what your story is?
Sure. So my parents, as the article reflects, were both Holocaust survivors. And, their story is one, I think, for anyone who didn't have a story, didn't survive the Holocaust. So their story was one of resilience and of taking every opportunity to survive to the next day at a time when they were subject to death penalty for simply being Jews. But it's important to underline here that there were a lot of people that were just as resourceful and just as determined to live another day who did not do so. That, in fact, most of the victims of the Holocaust, of course, were not so lucky. And my parents, through amazing circumstances, did survive. And I wouldn't be here to tell the tale otherwise. This is true of all second and third generation survivors. So basically, to really put it as briefly as I can, my mother was grew up in Bratislava, was going to school in Bratislava in a secular gymnasium with Jewish, which included Jewish and non-Jewish students, and it was a very egalitarian kind of institution, except towards the end of the 30s, when under the influence of Nazi Germany, Jews began to be treated already as persona non grata, and ultimately the Jewish students were thrown out of that school. My mother survived. She never was taken to one of the camps. She survived because her father, seeing the handwriting on the wall, sent his two daughters they were smuggled out of the country to Budapest, where they were not known. The Jewish community was at that time better off than in Bratislava. But besides that, my mother was not known. She spoke a fluent German without a Yiddish accent. She didn't look particularly Jewish, and was able to live on false papers from week to week, from month to month, moving from place to place, from job to job, somehow surviving and not being detected as being Jewish. In the course of that time, she came to work with the underground, the Jewish underground, the resistance, and she was charged with bringing weapons to the underground, which was a job. Generally women were being used to do smuggling because it was very easy for the Germans or their allies to identify a man as being Jewish, and so women were doing this very important work of smuggling the weapons out into the forests. And in addition to that story, towards the end of the war, when the Jews were being deported from Budapest, my mother came to work with Raoul Wallenberg, where he had these papers that were identifying people as supposedly under the protection of the Swedish government, and those had to be given out to the Jewish residents of Budapest. And my mother was involved in that project. She was one of the people working with Raoul Wallenberg. So I knew nothing about this story, by the way, till I was in my 30s or 40s, when a relative said to me, "Do you know what your mother was doing during the war?" And I said, "Well, she was surviving and hiding." And the relative says to me, No, she was involved in the resistance," which is a story my mother, until that point, had never told me about. And at that point, I began to learn much more about what she had done, not only to survive, but to help others to survive as well. So in that fashion, she survived through the balance of the war, and was in Budapest when the Soviets came and ousted the Nazi occupation. My father was also from Bratislava, although they didn't know each other before the war. And unfortunately for him, he was in fact deported to Auschwitz. I should note here that as well was his mother and my mother's father. They were all, by as best as we can tell, they were all probably on that same train that was deporting Jews from Bratislava to Auschwitz. And my two grandparents were never heard from again. They might have died on the train. If not, they certainly were murdered at Auschwitz. But I never knew any of my grandparents. My other two grandparents had already died, passed away before the war. So my father at Auschwitz is on the selection line. Many of your listeners will have heard of the selection line, in which the decision was made by the Nazis: who shall live and who shall die. Most of the unfortunate people arriving in Auschwitz, of course, were sent off to the gas chambers. But the person at the head of the line was asking, "Who amongst you is a welder? We need a welder." And my father raised his hand. And I should say right here, my father was a furrier, didn't know anything about welding, but he also saw that this was a chance for survival, raised his hand, was brought to the shop, which, as best as I can gather, was outside of the camp, one of those corporate shops that were outside of the camps. And the foreman there, a German foreman, immediately saw that my father didn't know anything about welding, but instead of turning him in, said to my father, "Here's your sample." So my father then had a sample to show the Gestapo when they came around. And then that foreman taught my father how to use the welding machine. And in this fashion, although of course he was starved and abused this whole time, he survived the balance of the war until again the Soviets came and liberated Auschwitz. And just to close out the story, my parents both then went back to Bratislava looking for relatives, many of course who had been lost in the Shoah, but they did find some relatives, and we also met each other for the first time and became a couple, and here I am. They ultimately moved to the United States, and I was born here, so I was born in the United States, but the aspect of my identity and the knowledge of what my parents had gone through is something that has been with me all of my life. I can't remember not knowing about the Holocaust, maybe not by that name, but even as a young child, I certainly knew that I had no grandparents, and that dreadful things had happened to my family and the rest of the Jewish communities of Europe in not too long before I was born.
Well, as long as I've known you, Richard, which is quite a long time, I have never heard that story, and it's a very moving story. But it also, for me, it kind of reminds me that when I hear Christians in this country complaining about, persecution and how badly they're treated, there's a larger context for understanding, the severity of religious freedom challenges, right? And I think your story kind of helps to be a little bit of a reality test for, okay, there's some real issues that we're facing in our nation, but they pale in magnitude compared to what others, I mean, others are facing actual potential death, or being killed for their faith in various countries around the world. It's still going on, not to the same degree, of course, as in Germany. But surely your own experience must make you very concerned to see the rise of neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic, conduct and attitudes becoming more mainstream in America these days. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a couple of points. One is, I am concerned when people so easily resort to saying somebody else is a Nazi or is like Hitler. I mean, to be sure, there have been genocidal maniacs in the world, even since World War II, and that's a reality. But I think we need to be very aware of what there always are challenges to religious freedom, but we have to be very aware of what the differences are. Nevertheless, what I think I have, and I realize this more the older I get, is how my family history influenced me in the sense that I became very aware how fragile civil society is, how fragile our liberties and rights are, and that to quote one of the framers, probably misquote him, that we need to become alarmed at any experimentation or tampering with our fundamental rights and liberties. And it all starts somewhere, because I described what happened to my mother in the school that she was in before the Nazis came to Czechoslovakia, and physically at least, so it starts with demonization, it starts with delegitimization, it starts with applying double standards to one set of people versus another, and if we're very lucky, it stops there. but that's a first step. These kinds of atrocities take place after the groundwork has been set. So, I think my commitment to working on these issues, both professionally and now, both as a fellow at the Freedom Fellow at the Freedom Forum, and in the work with the ABA that was mentioned earlier, really is my small effort to assure that there isn't a tampering with these rights and liberties, and that the protection of all minorities and of all citizens against those kinds of incursions is something that is foremost among our efforts as citizens of the United States.
Richard, I'm interested to know what your reaction is personally to the sort of not just the rise in anti-Semitic comments or ideology that we're seeing floating around, but also almost an acceptance of it within places where traditionally it would have found no comfort, like campuses of universities. There seems to be a real change in the culture, especially in those academic circles and the way these issues are discussed. Do you want to comment just a little on?
Yeah, I think it's important to. Needless to say, I'm extremely concerned, very troubled by this phenomenon, and one of the aspects of this is that you've got folks on the right and the left, both of whom are very quick to identify and condemn anti-Semitism coming from the other side, but who can't see the mote in their own eye, so when they or their allies engage in or do things that are anti-Semitic, they can't even see it. They're in denial that it's happening, and if you can't identify the problem, you can't respond to it. So it's very important, and it's great that when that horrific attack took place in Pittsburgh at the synagogue, which the greatest assault on a Jewish institution with the greatest number of fatalities, I think, in American history, that huge numbers of people from all kinds of backgrounds. I went up there the week after the delegation from my synagogue, and I saw people from all religious faiths, all ethnic and racial backgrounds, all there in solidarity to show their condemnation of that attack, and it's important that happened. But some of these same folks, some of the same people that condemned that attack, are themselves engaged in anti-Semitic kinds of expression, but they and their allies are in denial of that. And one of the places that shows up, you mentioned campuses. You now have a situation where Jewish students are being subjected to a litmus test before they can be accepted into a social justice project. And if they won't condemn the very existence of Israel, I'm not talking here about being critical of particular policies of Israel, which of course citizens of Israel are very happy to criticize the actions of Israel, to say nothing of the Jewish community. There are many people on both sides of many issues, and many of whom are sometimes very critical of Israel. But here the question is, do you support the very existence of the state of Israel? And a Jewish student who will not condemn the very existence of the state of Israel is told, you're a Zionist, you're not welcome here. Now, so first of all, that's a demonization, delegitimization, and utilization of anti-Semitic tropes all by itself. But on top of that, subjecting Jewish students to this kind of litmus test, whereas if any other minority group was subject to a litmus test, that if we're not going to accept you for a particular project if you won't disown Palestinian rights, for that matter, or affirmative action, or pick your
right.
cause.
Ask an African American student if they will reject Black Lives Matter.
If you as a Chinese American won't speak to what's going on in China vis-a-vis Muslim minorities, we're going to exclude you from being involved in issues and in arenas that have nothing to do with that issue. We would see that as rank discrimination. And yet when it is taking place in the context of Jewish students, it's excused and deflected. So that's, and of course my mother's experience reflects, excluding members of a particular group from universities or from social justice tables could be the first step towards further demonization of the entire population. So we have to, so I'm very concerned about this kind of hidden anti-Semitism or denied anti-Semitism. And I'll close as I said, but also we have to recognize that the physical dangers to Jews in the United States at the moment are from the right. There's exclusion on the campuses, and even harassment or deny, or students being shouted down when they try to say something that others don't want to hear about Israel, for instance. And then there's physical assault, and for the most part, the physical assaults are taking place from folks to the right, not exclusively. We've got folks in Brooklyn, identifiably Jewish people in Brooklyn, who are being attacked for being Jewish, and clearly the right is not involved in those attacks. But so I think we need to be aware where the greatest physical danger is coming from, but we also have to look down the road to what happens if other kinds of anti-Semitism aren't condemned and responded to as well.
When my son was attending a University of California campus, and I don't need to name which one, but he was aware that Jewish kids were being physically assaulted and attacked. So that really is so concerning.
Yeah. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Is there anything, Richard, we can take from this in a positive way in terms of how we can change either our attitudes or our behavior or our speech? What can we as ordinary citizens do to take this in a more positive direction?
Well, the word allyship is very popular these days for good reason. And I think being an ally to the Jewish community and hearing there and responding to the concerns of, and of course the Jewish community is very diverse, so I don't want to pretend you're going to get one response to this inquiry. But the point is that you should be hearing from people in the Jewish community. There's a terrible tendency of some folks to talk over or think that they're speaking for members of a particular group, where in fact all they're doing is incorporating their own world perspective and imputing it onto the Jews that they're pretending to speak for. So I think what's very important is to find ways to work together with the Jewish community, with individuals, with community organizations, and to look to those organizations and those individuals for guidance as to what it is that what Jews are concerned about and what they see as anti-Semitic and what they don't see as anti-Semitic.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. We've really appreciated you being willing to talk about these issues today, and I think we can take some important lessons from them. Thanks.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Bettina, Richard's story just kind of leaves me speechless. It's so sobering. It brings me back to, the various times that I've been to the Holocaust Museum or I've been to Yad Vashem, and you're confronted with, the reality
Right.
of, what that was all about. It's just
not
so
just
sobering.
not just the reality, but the scale. The magnitude of this is just beyond imagining. And hearing it, hearing those personal stories, you realize that each one of these individuals had a backstory. They had a place in the world that was forever taken from them. It's an incredibly sobering thought. Alan, as I listened to Richard, especially as he was talking about current challenges, it made me realize that we don't give enough attention to the fragility of the civil liberties that we enjoy. We don't understand how fragile they are.
Well, yes and no, because I think that on both the right and the left, there's a certain hysteria and fear that is marketed to drum up this idea that our liberties are insecure and the other side is, about to demolish them. So, yeah, on the one hand, there's a certain reality to it, but then the very fragility is used to kind of undermine our freedoms in the first place.
Well, that's a catch-22 situation. You can't win there.
No, you can't. But, I wanted to take this just slightly in a different direction for a moment, because I'm taken back to a couple of my visits to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And if our listeners have not been, that really should be on your list of things, that you must do, because it is among the very finest museums of any kind in the world today in terms of, its ability to move your spirit and, its emotive power. And there's one relatively smaller room that you walk through, and behind a display of clear lucite is an enormous collection of shoes, and they smell. They're kind of that sort of musty, moldy, smell like they've been stuck in an attic for a generation, as I guess they have. And that, when you talk about the scale, I'm reminded of the shoes. But the first time I was in that room, I was so overwhelmed by the shoes that I missed something that I saw the next time, which was a bale of human hair.
Oh, my.
That, before people were sent to the gas chambers, they were shaved, and their hair was used for commercial purposes. And the idea that, we're reducing human beings to a commodity is just so horrific.
Yeah. Alan, you're right in the sense that the idea of the fragility of civil rights is used as a kind of a scare tactic from both the right and the left. But I would point out, I think, that there is a growing intolerance for dissension and for free speech that is uncomfortable, for disagreement with prevailing ideology. And as Richard pointed out, that was, the beginnings of the Holocaust were not, major. They started small, and I think we would do well to guard the fundamental principles of liberal democracy and of civil rights, and to be cognizant of the dangers that exist. So I disagree with you slightly there. I think that, yes, we need to be aware that it is used and abused as a scare tactic, but there is a reality there.
No, I certainly agree. And, it's clear that it is from the left as well as from the right.
Right.
And we'll have to do shows that really explore some of the challenges to free speech, because it's, all of these First Amendment freedoms are so closely related.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe I'll close with this observation that when you go to worship, whether it's a church, a synagogue, wherever, yes, you're engaging in religious freedom, you're exercising those rights, but you're also exercising free speech rights, and freedom of assembly rights. So you've got all these First Amendment freedoms. And then if if like these days, a lot of congregations are broadcasting on Facebook or YouTube, well, that's a publication, right? So that's freedom of the press as well. So they're really all, they're all interconnected.
This has been Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, here with Alan Reinach. And until next time, remember,
eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.